It is my absolute pleasure to welcome Dr. Faizah Zakaria, Assistant Professor of History at NTU Singapore. Dr. Faizah researches on religion and ecology in maritime Southeast Asia. A book in progress, tentatively titled Spiritual Anthropocene and Ecology of Conversions in Upland Southeast Asia, is under contract with University of Washington Press. Today's talk is based on a book chapter in a forthcoming volume edited by Timothy Barnard on animals in post-war Singapore. Dr. Faizah will explore the history of the cage bird trade in Singapore from the 1950s onwards, as well as the changing fates of several avian species once a garden city vision took hold in the state. Complicating the garden were cage birds which escaped or were released, establishing viable populations that competed with indigenous birds for territorial advantage. Since the 1980s, this has resulted in ornithological designations of migrant resident and indigenous birds that have informed conservation initiatives and raised troubling questions about which birds belong in Singapore. Dr. Faizah discusses how these developments led to the emergence of civil environmentalism in two keys, each offering a different ethics of care for endangered species. I will now pass the time over to Dr. Faizah. Faizah, please.
Thanks, Cheryl. Thanks for the great introduction. And as mentioned by Cheryl, this is not, in some sense, primarily related to my book project. It's a side project that's sort of developed from being stuck in Singapore during the pandemic and exploring, I think, little known corners, to me at least, of various sites in Singapore. And one of the magical places I discovered was this Kebun Baru bird singing arena, which is one of the few, I think, left from this very active period of bird singing competitions in the 1970s and the 1990s. And it's exciting to see, I think, such a big crowd of songbird enthusiasts gathering, I think, every Sunday. And there's a kind of magical feeling about atmosphere about this sort of cases, which I was interested to probe. But one of my key inspirations also comes not just from cage birds or looking at cage birds or the kind of experience of cage bird songbird arenas, but also looking at escapees, or in some ways I would think of them as refugees of the songbird trade. And one of them is this really cute white crested laughing thrush, which had maintained a sort of sizable population in Bukit Batok, near where my parents live. So every weekend I'll kind of go to the Bukit Batok Nature Reserve and they'll be like gliding about, cackling maniacally. So to get a sense of what it sounds like, I will play this video. So there we are, like sort of shaking their heads and looking very cute. And what is so adorable, I think, about them is this sort of sociality and the kind of ways they gather in groups and come across as really very friendly. And I was surprised, I think, when I want to look up, okay, what is this bird? This is so cute. It has this kind of white crown on its head. And found out that it was sort of designated as kind of feral species. So you kind of think about, when you think about the word feral, you think about tigers or lions or, pretty fierce creatures and not very, very cute laughing thrushes. So I was interested in looking further and found out that they were escapees from the exotic songbird trade appearing in Singapore around the late 1980s, when the first sighting was just a group of 3 birds, one of them a very tiny juvenile begging for food. And from this small population, they grew to establish colonies in Cambridge and Bukit Batok, and they developed, they bred and developed a viable population here. And in that process, sort of displaced some of the native species of birds because they were more social, because they tend to be tend to be able to crowd out, I think, less aggressive birds in this territory. So that's why they're considered feral, and we should still think it's a bit of an unfair designation. And we'll come back and talk about these distinctions later on. But the case of the laughing thrush then led me to wonder about the dynamics of the songbird trade, which birds were introduced, how do they interface with native species, and what kind of experiences the pet bird owners sort of have with these new imports. And what I'll do in this talk is to give a quick overview about some of the key developments from the 1950s to the late 1990s, I think, when the songbird trade was most active, and examine then more deeply the sort of environmental optics that developed from interactions with the songbirds, and then return to the experiences of the songbirds themselves, including the white-breasted laughing thrush, and examine their experiences, I think, in Singapore, and in integrating into the sort of fabric of Singapore's environment. Okay. So first, I think it's important to establish what is a songbird, and the technical definition is that they are birds which are mainly perching birds or passerines who are distinguished by having muscles of the syringe attached to the bronchial semi-rings. I'm not going to give a biological explanation for what that means, but it gives a sense about how we can identify these birds through their biological makeup. But it's important to note that this is not the only criteria for which you can define a songbird. Some birds don't have muscles of the syringe attached to the bronchial semi-rings, but are still considered songbirds. For example, this pretty bird, the zebra dove, in the Malay world, a very popular songster. People like the sort of cooing sound, so it's called merbod, and it's a variety of dove. It's not a perching bird, but it's the sounds that they create make them popular as a pet, and they're also bird singing competitions centered around the zebra dove. So socially, they can be constituted as a songbird, even though scientifically this definition might not be accurate. Another bird that is interesting to look at is this very common Javan myna, or the white-waisted myna. We don't often think of it as a songbird, but it is a popular songbird in Java. So again, you can see sort of different social constructions of what it means to be a songbird. And the Javan myna has the characteristics of biological characteristics of a songbird. It does have the muscles of the syringe attached to the bronchial semi-rings. So even though we in Singapore don't really consider this bird as a songbird, biologically it is. So it is part of the complex of birds that we're going to examine. So we'll return, I think, to these ideas about different experiences of birds, who's accepted as a songbird, who is not, and come back to this at the end of the lecture. Okay, so when do we start seeing evidence of a thriving songbird trade? In the late 19th century, we can see travelers giving descriptions about the persistence of a wildlife trade, and particularly songbirds. So for example, Anabrisi in 1881, traveling on this boat called the Sunbeam, describes how Wiltshire River, at that time not reclaimed yet, was alive with birds in baskets, cages, and coops. And you have these native open boats arriving from islands around the Malay world, landing in Singapore with a tripod mast, and you have all kinds of birds perched on on the various tripod masts of the boat. So, so that river, that sort of river trade of birds later became a series of bird shops that lined North Bridge Road and Rocher Road, so which is now National Library SMU. And you can see from this picture at least how much birds were part of this landscape of other exotic wildlife trade during this particular period before the Second World War. So after the Second World War, and following the resettlement policies of first the self-rule government and then the PAP government in independent Singapore, these bird shops were moved to HDB estates, and we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. And they sort of were dismantled and reallocated to different places, partly in line with this garden city vision of Singapore as a space where you can neatly curate the existence of bird life and designate them to particular places, and integrate them into this picture of greenery that will be refreshing for people in an urban city. So this started around the mid-1960s. So from the first estate, I think, to get a bird arena was the Tiong Bahru estate, where you can see sort of space allocated. This idea about allocating space for a coffee shop, a pet shop, and bird stands all in close proximity, so to enable residents to gather and talk about their pet birds in a way that sort of mimics the kampong lifestyle without having the same kind of aesthetic. So they would like hook their birds on a brick-like structure here. This is from Bukit Batok, not from Tiong Bahru, one of the surviving ones today. And then they would sit down and talk about their birds or talk about their day while the birds are singing overhead. And it's really quite, it's a hobby that a lot of people enjoy, even though we have the pandemic, they're still together. So this is actually a picture I took at Bukit Batok during a pandemic. And you can see the socially distanced chairs. So they're still sitting around listening to birds in socially distant ways. So I think it sort of attests to the comfort maybe that the birds brought in this period of time. So some estates like Kebun Baru, which opened the picture that opened, I think, my presentation, you can see the bird stands are placed in an open field, they're as high as a flagpole, and birds flexing overhead. Others is a more intimate setting, they're pretty low down, but still hoisted up a certain height so as to induce kind of the best songs from the birds. And the resettlement into HDB estates meant that the pet bird landscape sort of simplified. And by that, I meant that the preferences for which birds to keep sort of narrowed to 5 types: the Oriental white-eye, or in Malay mata putih, the Chinese huami, the red-whiskered bulbul, or in Malay jambul, zebra dove, merbok, and the white rum shama, which is also called shama. So the reason for why there was a narrowing, I think, for pet bird preferences was because of the ways that birds learn their songs, partly by imitating each other. So in each bird arena, you would have a group of birds of the same species, usually next to each other, kind of richly learning from each other's songs. And that meant that having a sort of broad diversity of bird species might not be conducive for your bird. So if you have a exciting bird that that is not of one of these 5 species, you might find that its sound would change after some time. So there's a kind of convergence, I think, to certain preferred species. So part of the reason why pet birds, the existence of pet birds were encouraged in HDB estate was also partly because of political patronage of the pet bird industry. And the economic reasons for that, which I'll go into in the next slide, but there are also political reasons for that. One is to recreate, I think, the communality of the kampung from which which was affected by the resettlement exercise. Secondly, to kind of fit into this idea about garden cities, having birds, having trees, having greenery and soothing sounds, it's sort of set of an urban aesthetic that is at harmony with nature. And you can see throughout the 1970s and 1980s, there were so many pictures of so many ministers giving out trophies to winners of bird singing contests. And for at least one of them, Goh Chok Tong in 1980, he used that as an opportunity to sort of get a political message across. So saying that you shouldn't set down crows or among shamas and jambus just to have an opposition for opposition's sake. I think this was a particularly tight election, so I'm not sure how much people bought into his message, but the PAP won, as they did every year. So every election. So anyway, the idea here was that there is a kind of political incentive to be visible in this bird singing contest, either because it was popular among a lot of people and you can reach a cross section of the population through this contest, or because it also helps the government at that point in time bring across the idea of what development could look like, and birds were part of that picture. Pet birds, at least, were part of the picture. So one of the reasons why it was encouraged also was the fact that it was quite lucrative. From this sort of small pet bird business to catering to maybe about 25,000 bird owners in the 1980s, the pet bird shops also became, some of them became multi-million-dollar businesses that grew to accommodate the export trade. So what happened is that bird dealers would not just sell to Singaporean pet bird owners, but also use their shops as a means to get pet birds processed, as well as ready for the export market. And then from there, most of the, I think about 80% of the birds that were actually brought to these pet dealers ended up being re-exported to other parts of Asia. So this was here quite a huge business, and it was also related to the growth of tourism. So Jurong Bird Park set up in the late 1970s, and you have the sort of existence of these bird arenas marketed as tourist attractions by the Singapore Tourism Board. So this involved, for example, this guy who was quite a famous flautist at that time in 1982, coming down Tiong Bahru and playing his flute among the birds. So, and kind of bringing up this idea, this exotic part of Singapore, I think, to a larger part of the world. Same thing with the movie Cages in 2014. I didn't catch that, but if you did, you can catch a glimpse of Singapore. The Tiong Bahru Bird Arena, I think, also featured in that movie. So there is the kind of economic value that's attached to the songbird trade, and the potential for growth economically was part of the reason why it was encouraged by the state, I think, in the 1970s and 1980s. So with the flourishing, I think, of the bird trade, as well as bird singing competitions, and the existence of neighborhood bird stands, the state sort of also marked their interest in birds through this bird series of currency, which was launched from 1976 to circulated, I think, from 1976 to 1984. And it features a mix of native and non-native bird species, which is quite interesting because I think it signifies a kind of naturalization of imported birds that was reflecting what was happening, I think, in the pet bird shops, coming in through the shop and then coming out to the, going out to other parts of the world, Singapore being some kind of stapling point. So, some of the birds featured in this series, such as terns, the black-necked oriole, Brahminy kites, and so on, they are non-native species. Some of them are native species, such as the bulbul, kingfisher, sunbird, and the shama. And not all of them here are songbirds. The bulbul and the shama are the most popular. But here you can see they're featuring, I think, in this bird series of currency notes. indicating a certain a prestige or kind of investment in this in the well-being of these birds at the point in time. So this market structure, as well as political encouragement of the bird trade, was also reflected in some of the measures taken by the Singapore state in terms of international trade in songbirds. So, as mentioned previously, we could see the export market being important for bird dealers, and birds caught in Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, China, and so on, pass through Singapore for transferring to the United States and Europe. And bird owners from this part of the world, from these parts of the world, prefer to import from Singapore because, according to this bird dealer association chairman at the time, they know we take good care of the birds and keep them healthy during the quarantine period. So the reputation for being sorry, able to systematically enforce a regime that could keep the birds healthy, could keep them sort of well, and could take care of the welfare through this whole process of migrating from their point of origin to a new owner in the United States and Europe actually helped Singapore at the time. But even in the 1970s, you could see criticism arising that this sort of enforcement mechanism is basically whitewashing the smuggling of protected birds from Southeast Asia to other parts of the world. So I don't think there's documentary evidence for me in some ways to make an assessment of the level of licit versus illicit trade during this particular period, but I think there is certainly a case to be made that the way that this trade is conducted would facilitate the smuggling of some protected wildlife from other parts of Southeast Asia and China. So Singapore was a reluctant signatory of CITES, so the Convention of International Trade in Endangered Species of Flora and Fauna, and they signed it in 1986, more than 10 years after the convention went in force in 1975. And I think part of the delay was its concern about the pet bird trade as well as the exotic fish trade, which was at that point in time a lucrative part of Singapore's market. So after the signing this convention in 1986, about a decade later, you could see the decline in the practice of keeping songbirds, partly because the prices of birds went up and the subsidies for pet shops in HDB estates were withdrawn, further driving prices up. So at this point in time, the practice of keeping songbirds is quite an expensive one. And for that reason, it's kind of limited only to very passionate enthusiasts, many of whom are now elderly. So this is a kind of overview of the rise and fall of the songbird keeping practices in Singapore. What I want to discuss next is what kind of environmental optic emerges from these experiences of keeping songbirds, and what kind of environmental actions do birds, and specifically songbirds, inspire. Oops, I'm having trouble moving my mouse. So when we think about songbirds as pets, I'm reminded, of course, as a lot of people in environmental humanities would, of Yu Chuan's Dominance and Affection, where he describes the pet basically as a victim where dominance is combined with affection. And the description of this highlights, I think, how much there is an underlying sense of care in wishing to keep a pet bird and keep that pet bird alive, while at the same time being part of an exploitative system. So when we look at this in the Singapore context, what kind of activities, for example, do cage bird societies or Club Roam Singapore what did they take part in, and what kind of environmental efforts did they promote? I think that most of their activities seems to be geared towards showcasing species of birds and encouraging public education on the kind of through knowledge of I think birds not normally seen in urban Singapore. For example, bringing them to Happy Meal Amusement Park in the 1950s. You see a lot of people kind of walking at the hornbill there. So the this sort of educational effort, I think it was seen as a move towards conservation, but not something that was really taken seriously by environmentalists, who could be quite dismissive of pet bird owners as allies in this sort of effort, partly because their mode of education involved basically kind of captive model. So is this criticism fair? I think it might be useful to zoom out at the different kinds of environmentalisms emerging globally, and then zoom back into Singapore and the pet bird owners and seeing what kind of actions do pet bird owners as well as wildlife advocates push for. So some of the, if we think about types of environmentalist ideologies, I think they could be roughly divided into three poles. The first involves thinking about wilderness. It's invested in intact ecosystems. It prefers the conservation of areas that are untouched by humans, and it comes with a certain degree, I think, of romanticizing of the wild. And we can think of 19th century writers such as Thoreau, for example, talking about his life in a tiny cabin in the woods, and how that changed his point of view about how to live his life. So the wilderness paradigm, in a sense, calls for action by changing our values. We need to change our values in order to effect environmental change. But in around the 1950s, I think there emerged, I think, a more attractive sustainability paradigm that is invested in maintaining non-human populations at levels such that they can reproduce, they can live on as a species, but not necessarily thrive in exactly the same way as compared to a kind of benchmark set in the past. So we have activities like recycling, promoting renewables, thinking about how to close the loop of production, coming up with this sustainability paradigm. And the action that needs to be taken then is to think about ways to innovate such that our consumption does not break ecological limits. So this is a breakaway from thinking about wilderness to thinking about ways in which we can live with our current level of consumption while moving on to protect non-human species. And lastly, I think around the 1990s, there starts to be a recognition, I think, that it is not just the well-heeled who were interested in the welfare of the environment, but some of the actions that's taken by the poor to protect their livelihood could also be read as a form of environmentalism. And this comes with a recognition that the poor were the ones, the rural poor at least, were the ones living with and harvesting nature's bounties, and they're in some sense the best ecological guardians. And this now came, I think, towards the end of the 20th century, more awareness that there needs to be a need to restore indigenous land rights, for example, to implement policies for redistribution, to marry social justice and environmental justice, if there was to be a kind of radical shift or kind of lift forward for the environmental movement. So in Singapore, how does this translate into our local actions? So let's start with environmentalism for the poor. It's clearly not an ethos that Singaporeans espouse, and that's partly because I think the Singapore state's attitude towards the rural poor from the 1950s seems to be, let's first not make them rural, and secondly, hopefully in a few generations, not make them poor. So the resettlement of rural communities and the encouragement of high capital urban farming in place of these rural communities basically stymied any sort of move towards a broad-based set of environmentalism of the poor, which leaves us with the two keys which was referred to in the abstract. One that is sort of invested in sustainability, and another that is invested in wilderness. So some of the actions that's taken by wilderness advocates, and here I include, for example, groups like ACRES, Singapore Nature Society, and so on, were to campaign for preserving spaces in Singapore where bird populations roost, feed, and reproduce. And it involves a recognition of the value of these spaces for their own sake. And I put wilderness out of its scare quotes here, partly because we don't really have that much wilderness in Singapore anymore. So the attention then is turned towards more recognizing the value of hybrid spaces where humans and non-humans could live together. And some of the actions taken, for example, the campaign to preserve Sungai Buloh, led by Singapore Nature Society, makes this case for mangrove forests, for example, for coastal wetlands should be preserved for the benefit of non-human populations. Sort of, in some sense, competing with that are these sort of sustainability advocates that starts their action from the point, from a starting point of captivity. And I think some of the actions that has been taken in this direction have been stepped back. For example, captive breeding programs of endangered birds supported by the National Parks Board. So the starting point here is that we need to think about how do we keep these particular species alive, not necessarily how do we keep the spaces where they need to be alive intact. So that's a different sort of optic. And we can kind of read the Singapore's environmental discourse, I think, as a struggle or a kind of contest between these two modes of environmentalism. So the problem with the wilderness paradigm was that after its very early successes, I think in the early 1990s, the public campaigns that were led by the Singapore Nature Society, later on advocated by ACRES, for example, did not really succeed, even though they may be co-opted into giving feedback, I think, to some developmental programs that the state wanted to put in motion. So for these groups who originated from, I think, a bird study group that was formed as part of Malayan Nature Society in the 1950s, and it on split from Malaya in the 1990s because it wants to establish that it was an independent agent, independent entity. They were invested, I think, in keeping the habitats of birds preserved for the use of these birds. And this does not just involve birds that people like to keep as pets, but also a more broad, inclusive view of migratory birds, for example, and birds from transient birds who came in from different parts of the world. So in some sense, it's a very inclusive object that is difficult to that could be difficult to sell to the public. So part of the reason was that the way that some of these campaigns were couched also did not quite capture the imagination, either as kind of a coherent wilderness or a coherent sort of garden aesthetic. So one failed campaign, I think that was fairly well known, was this push to conserve the ash ponds around Senoko Power Plant and Serangoon Search Treatment Plant in, I think, around 1995, which was a very secure roosting place for tide-dependent water birds, and had a lot of organic matter insects to maintain a thriving population. But unlike Sungai Buloh, it didn't really get, it got a fair number, a significant amount of public support, but I think did not quite capture the imagination in the same way. There's a difference between saying, let's save a mangrove forest versus let's save an insect-ridden sludge pond. I think that's a different kind of qualitative ecological imaginary that comes from that. So when we think about conserving ecosystems and conserving habitats, then hinging them on the value of hybridity or on the value of wilderness means rendering them, I think, vulnerable to how people sort of imagine this, the value or um, the attractiveness of that site, and that is generally difficult to. It's generally difficult to kind of canvas a kind of broad-based support, although I think this might be changing, I think, over the last few years. So it's interesting to note, I think, if you were to compare what's happening across the Causeway, Malay Energy Society also had trouble trying to conserve ash ponds in power plants in Selangor for harboring birds, perhaps because of that same kind of limitations of the ecological imagination. Sustainability and efforts towards promoting sustainability has had more success, I think, and the Singaporean state is generally more receptive towards such an approach than it is towards kind of broad-based public education to eliminate land for birds. So, for example, as been cited just now, is the Singapore Parks Board working with traffic to host crisis summits and provide funding for genetic research, captive breeding, husbandry, community education, and better enforcement against illegal trade to mitigate the dwindling population of songbirds in Asia. So this approach, while beneficial in some ways for promoting better enforcement and in providing a lane for future breeding in captivity, is limited by the fact that it sort of sidelines this issue of habitat loss. It doesn't provide a motivation to preserve landscapes, and it detaches the bird from the forest ecosystem that they live in. So the songbird then, if we want to think about endangered songbirds being bred in captivity, becomes a bird or kind of like the one kind of alienated subject for intervention without thinking about where this bird came from, what kind of forest systems are they living in, why are they actually in danger. And having this sort of optic means that you are attuned to thinking about how do we quantify how many birds they would possibly need for the survival of the species, and accepting, I think, non-human losses beyond a certain sort of predetermined carrying capacity. And that model has its critics, even though in some sense Singapore is exporting it. So I would just sort of share something I read a couple of days ago about an Australian company with its Singaporean backers and a private equity firm that's based in Singapore, inking a deal with several ministers to run 2 million hectares of Bornean rainforest to basically manage sort of the carbon that they their position, I think, is carbon sinks. So that sort of positions the rainforest itself as a form of capital and resource to be managed and financed by experts. And that sort of optic, in some sense, is aligned with the kind of sustainability paradigm that that's been promoted in Singapore. But this was done without much consultation from indigenous communities, and that becomes problematic. So just to sort of emphasize and round this up, what do all these mean for the birds? So who would survive in this sort of setting? First of all, the sort of resilient Javan miner. They survived because they could live in an urban setting, feeding off, I think, the scraps from human communities, and it became quite prolific here, but a little bit persecuted. So when people sort of try to justify the culling of Javan miners, I mean, the trope of the migrant bird and how it poses a danger for our ecology comes into play. So when you have reports of mass shooting of this bird by the AVA, for example, is almost always accompanied by an emphasis that these are foreign birds. You might be interested in looking at this art exhibition called The Migrant on the Javan miner and how it ended up here. It's quite interesting. But the position of this bird, I think, depended on the ability to adapt to urban landscapes. They're not due to any sort of, and their thriving populations is not due to any sort of action, I think, from the Singapore society as a whole. Then we have the white-crested laughing thrush, who I opened with, and it's now in a position where it's a foreigner that's kind of tolerated, but not really accepted as or a species of bird that people have very much affection for. So I used to read pet forums where people talk about sightings of white-crested laughing thrush. You can see them mostly in Cambridge near NUS and in Bukit Batok. And there'll be some people will be enthusing about this, and then inevitably someone will come in a comment and say, you know what, this is actually a foreign bird, maybe we shouldn't like it too much. So it's kind of like, people kind of like it because it's cute, but and they're surviving, I think, because they are able to socialize and be able to kind of claim the territory in Singapore's nature reserves for a small but reproducible population. But it doesn't seem likely that they will kind of grow beyond that. And it doesn't seem likely that Singaporeans want them to grow beyond a certain level either. The zebra dove, which is a native bird, and like the Javan myna, also a common sort of man. And despite being trapped for the songbird trade, it's one of the few birds that actually not only survived, but I think thrived post 1990s, and it's now quite a common sight in different parts of the island. And part of the reason, again, was that it is able to adapt to a kind of urban city environment, particularly thriving in gardens and parks. So it's a bird that's peculiarly suited for a garden city. And lastly, if we were to sort of embrace both a garden city optic as well as a sustainability ethos that comes with that, then we will risk losing birds like the white rock charmer, which is defined by its beautiful long tail here. So it's a kind of bird that needs the rainforest, and that is and would find it difficult to adapt, partly because I think of its tail to the urban setting, to an urban setting, and was further endangered because it's so attractive in the songbird world, one of the most melodious singers, I think, among all the songbirds. And now there are just like maybe 6 or 7 sightings yearly at the southern islands in Singapore. It used to be very prominent, I think, the central catchment area, but I think over the last 10 years it's sort of disappeared. So promoting, I think, that sort of garden city aesthetic is not going to be conducive for these birds. And I think as a society, then we have to decide whether that's worth the cost. But the discourse, I think, between migrant birds and indigenous birds, when we think about conservation, even though we may note, I think, some of the ways in which invasive ecologies could affect native populations, it's also important to bear in mind that the long decline of bird populations in Singapore was mostly due to deforestation, and that extinctions happen pretty much across all species from the when you look at the period from 1965 to the present. So in some ways, it kind of reminds me of this cartoon when you see the sort of designation of indigenous versus foreign utilized for birds, it might sort of disguise this long-term trend where the real cause of the loss is actually the deforestation that was occurring. So even though we might see the Javan myna as kind of displacing native birds, that's not the main problem. So where do I go from here? So in some sense, it's what I've sketched out. Some of the ways in which we can see the managed rise and fall of songbird competitions and the keeping of songbirds as a habit in Singapore society from 1950s to the present. And it will be interesting, I think, to follow up, I think, with a spatial map of bird singing arenas, for example, looking out to see whether Sengkang or new estates coming up also allocate this sort of spaces, what kind of spaces replace them, or follow up with more quantitative oral history interviews where I sort of conducted a few and got some suggestive ideas. For example, it seems that there is quite a active informal trading of secondhand birds after the prices increases in the 2000s. So what are the dynamics of this market? I think it's pretty hard to see. And it's a bit difficult, I think, for me to, because it's such a coded, it's such a space that's coded as male. It's a bit difficult for me to kind of approach songbird owners and have a chat with them, especially if they are old Chinese men. So, and partly because of language barriers, partly because they look a bit weird. So, but it'll be interesting to see why bird keeping remains coded as a male activity and is active basically among a certain demographic only. So that's it, and I'll leave you with the red-wristed bulbul and say thank you.